It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Bray Literary Festival two of Dublin's best known writers, Roddy Doyle and Paul Howard. And we're going to be chatting a bit about Dublin and Dublin's representation and what it means to be a writer here and all those sort of things. They probably don't need introductions, but I will just give a brief rundown of some of the achievements. So I think everyone is very well aware of who Roddy Doyle is. His books include going all the way back to what were called the Barrytown trilogy, The Commitments, The Van, and The Snapper. Then there was Family on RTE, which then gave rise to Paula Spencer, a great figure who appeared in The Woman Who Walks Into Doors and the sequel Paula Spencer. There was Paddy Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, of course, which won the Booker Prize, all about another Barrytown book, really, following Paddy Clarke, age 10 in 1960s Dublin. There was a series about Henry Smart. These are more going back 100 years, really. A trilogy in the end, following him through the Rising and the Civil War, things like that. More recently, then, we have the whole 2 pints scenario. There's a number of children's books. There are films. There are plays. So a hugely prolific and very well-known writer, Roddy Doyle. And then we have Paul Howard, and everyone will know Paul Howard through the figure of Ross O'Carroll Kelly, who, if memory serves, began life in the Sunday Tribune, where I think Paul was a journalist back about 22 years ago, and has given rise to a series of novels. I believe they run to about 19 now, including the latest one, Braywatch. There's some plays there as well. There's another novel about Roy Keane's dog, if I remember right. And then there are some non-fiction, including, let me think now. There's biographies of George Hook. There's the spat between McCarthy and Keane. There's one about the Mountjoy as well, if I remember right. So again, a hugely prolific author. A couple of musicals there in the background as well. Multi-genre people here. Very, very enviable, really.
I'm gonna have to stop. I'm gonna have to shout stop any second.
Oh.
I don't know how Roddy feels. I find it really uncomfortable listening to that role. You know, the roll call.
I hate putting on the spot like that. There we go.
At least I have the comfort of knowing I worked with Roy Keane. Poor old Paul worked with his dog.
Very good. Well, first of all, I suppose I might just ask you both to talk a little bit about the latest work. In your case, Roddy, I believe Love is due out imminently.
Yeah.
It's a novel, and a little bit like the way Ross O'Carroll Kelly began life as a figure in the Sunday Tribune. This began life as, if memory serves, as 2 pints on Facebook, which then became 2 pints on as a stage play. No, okay, that's great. I love getting things wrong. It began how
2 men in a pub, but they're 2 very different men. It's a bit,
2 very different men. Okay.
Yeah, it's a different kind of story altogether than 2 pints.
Okay, terrific. Would you like to tell us a little bit about this story? It's Joe and Davy, isn't that right?
Oh, I hate giving summaries of books. It's really, yeah, they're 2 men who've known each other all their lives, but they drifted apart. One of them literally because he emigrated to England. They meet up maybe every 6 months or so. They used to go on the lash. Now they meet for something to eat. They're very close to 60, and they bring each other up to date about the families or whatever, and promptly forget it all. But this night, something happens, something clicks. So it's a figure from their past is, if you like, put on the table.
Okay.
They go off on a long conversation that lasts all night. And there's a lot of tension. It's about memory and the refusal to share memory. It's about grief. It's about youth and the loss. It's about love. And so it's not 2 pints, it's a full length.
Okay.
Because they're men, they try to talk about their emotions, but men of my age, we don't find that easy. So if they were younger, I'd like to think it would have been a short story, but because they're my age, it's actually a novel. It took, which is great because it kept me out of trouble for a year and a half while I was writing it.
It's like that famous George Bernard Shaw, I'm writing you a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short letter. Now, having said that, I mean, I remember, I think it was 2 years ago, I saw Two Pints in the Abbey.
Yeah.
Lorcan Cranach and Liam Carney, if I remember right. I thought Liam Carney was fantastic. But again, I mean, yes, it's humorous and funny, but it took you through all those emotions as well, and there were all
Yeah,
those
but that's,
themes to it.
yeah, it's not, you know, I don't have an ingredient book, so I don't have, you know, how much humor will I put in as against, you know, tragedy, or, you know,
Sure.
just the mix, if you like. And I've been writing the 2 Pints pieces, which were very, very short, and posting them on Facebook for years. And the suggestion was made that I write a play based on it all. And I had a longish conversation with a man in London. We were both comparing notes. His mother had recently died, and my father had recently died. And we were both making each other laugh, you know, about the world at the hospital and things like that. And I thought, you know, by the end of the conversation, I thought, well, I've got the plot for the play there, you know. So yeah, I'd like to think that 2 Pints was, it's supposed to be touring at the moment, believe it or not.
I know.
It was cancelled. But I'd like to think it's very funny, but at the same time, it's about grief, it's about loss, you know, because the first act was a few days before the father died. The second act is one of the characters is waiting for the phone call from his sister to come up to the hospital to say goodbye to the father. And the third act then is the night of the funeral. So there's a plot there. And,
Absolutely.
so I wrote it about 6 months after my father died. And I think a lot of the energy that went into it, you know, because, you know, Paul will know as well, that, you know, starting a play and getting to the end, you know, it's like climbing a mountain in a way. And but a lot of the energy was the grief, and actually the strong knowledge that I knew my father, if he'd been alive to see it, would have liked it. You know?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. And I mean, just while we have you on this particular subject, one thing I'm going to be asking both of you is, and I think that our viewers would be very interested in, how different and how more difficult or easy is it to write specifically for the stage, like for live theatre, as opposed to writing narrative, writing a book, even if a book may be largely dialogue? They're very different disciplines, aren't they?
They are, yeah. Yeah, extremely.
Yeah, I mean, I found that with the Rossachara Kelly plays, and, you know, I mean, the Rossachara Kelly plays are, you know, it's the same characters as populate the pages of the books, and that the humor is very, very different. I find in the books and in the weekly columns, I can be a bit more subtle. Like I can write a line, and I can, you know, be reasonably confident that whoever reads it is going to, if it's a kind of slow burner joke, they'll kind of read it back and then might grin to themselves and say, actually, that's quite clever. Whereas when you're in a theatre setting, I think the jokes have to be a little bit clearer, because the worst thing you can have is people turning to each other. What was that? Because they're missing the next joke. I think with that, and Roddy and I have both been lucky enough to work with Jimmy Fay, the director,
Right.
and I learned so much from him, you know, from doing the Ross plays. And, you know, he taught me that, you know, he taught me to, you know, leave breathing space between the jokes, make them clearer. Don't have people turning to each other saying, "What do you think that was about?" And that was a great thing to learn. But it is completely, it's completely different. There's also the fact that something happens during the rehearsal period, and we generally rehearse the Ross plays for about a month. And for the first week, when you do the table read and all the actors come together and they're doing the lines for the first time, and then they finally get off book, and it's everybody's laughing and everybody finds it funny. And then in week 2 and 3, the laughter in the room stops, absolutely stops. There is nothing about this script that is funny anymore, because repetition has just stolen all of the laughter from it. And then in week 4, you start to think, was this ever funny? Like, were we kidding ourselves? So when you go into the theatre on the opening night, you have absolutely no idea whether it's funny. And also, interestingly, what bits are funny, because sometimes the jokes that you think are going to bring the house down just blow like tumbleweed through the theatre. and the jokes that might be to use a football metaphor, a tap in from 6 yards out, they tend to bring the house down. Sometimes jokes that you actually consider discarding in the last couple of days. So it's that, I think that's what makes it utterly terrifying. Just how different it is. With a book, you send it out there and people might tell you, actually, I quite enjoyed that last book, or I didn't think it was as good as the one before that, or whatever. But in a theater, when you're sitting in a theater, especially when you've written a comedy, you find out very, very quickly whether people find what you've written funny, because if there's no laughter,
yeah,
that's
absolutely,
worse
sure.
for you, if nobody's laughing at your jokes.
There's the practical side of it as well, that the characters are on a stage and you're stuck with that. There's nothing you can do about that. If you're writing a novel, it can be any length you want it to be, and the character can reminisce for as long as you want him, or as long as seems right, whereas you can't do that. I remember reading about, the practicalities of Shakespeare when Shakespeare actually was producing the plays and they didn't use a curtain. And the realization that the reason why all those characters died at the end of the tragedies, because, if they died too early, there was nowhere for them to go. You have a dead body on the stage for the duration of the play. They couldn't crawl off because that would have distracted the audience, So it's like Hamlet, they all kind of keel over at the end of the play, That's because, then the play's over, then they can stand up and take a bow. And what's good enough for Shakespeare is good enough for the rest of us. You're kind of hemmed in. You've got the stage and you've got the wings. And I remember Enda Walsh actually did away with wings for one play. So his characters were stuck on the stage for the entire thing. And that was part of its brilliance. But it really is it's a very practical, almost a physical thing that's with you all the time as you write. If you've got 5 characters and 2 of them are talking, what are the other 3 doing? When you're writing a novel, you don't really have to worry about that.
Sure, yeah.
Or if you do, it's a different kind of worry. It's a different kind of anxiety. But you can safely send them off to the shops and not worry too much about when they come back. Whereas if they're on stage or if they're part of the story, they have to be accommodated. They have to be thought about all the time. So it's an entirely different exercise, really. It doesn't have the same freedom as writing fiction, I find. But the challenges are different. Particularly, you could tell, I think, from Paul's talking about the rehearsal, that, even if people do stop laughing, and they do, the only thing they laugh at in week 3 is the mistakes. The fuck-ups are hilarious,
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's
you're the only one in the room taking serious notes because, they're destroying your work and everybody else thinks it's funny.
One reason that I'm very interested in this, besides the fact that I try to write plays myself, is you're both very well known, I think. Celebrated would be a word probably, for your ear, the way you use your ear for dialogue, and how there are different kinds of dialogue that you absolutely nail, whether it's the Dort speak, of D4, or the inner city Dublin and all that. But having an ear for dialogue doesn't necessarily make one a good dramatist. I mean, Joyce's Exiles is a very poor play, and he had a great ear for dialogue, I think. So dramatic structure is very different. As you say, Roddy, I mean, in a novel, an audio book will normally be 20 to 30 hours. On a stage, you might have an hour and a half, and there's nothing but dialogue and stage action. So it's a hugely different discipline just to hone that. And what is it that makes drama isn't necessarily a good ear for dialogue. It's dramatic action, or the dramatic moment, or dramatic comedy, as you say, Paul, is very different,
Yeah, I like what Brendan Behan said about it, and this kind of, I've tried to apply this to my plays as well. It's just, I set out to keep the audience laughing, and then when everybody's laughing, you can do whatever you want to them. You can take them because they're distracted by the humor, and you can get those. There's always 1 or 2 awe moments in the Ross plays, and and then there's lots of jokes, but there's always the sort of the drama, and I try to make that kind of sort of creep up on the audience, sort of taps them on the shoulder while they're laughing, and they say, "That's what was happening. That's what was happening all along."
Great. That kind of segues into my next thought for discussion, I suppose, which is the use of comedy and comic and humorous, while smuggling is the wrong word, but smuggling in real punches, real emotional hits and things like that. So, for example, I found, I don't know if you I was meant to find it, but I found Paddy Clarke Ha 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 to be a funny book, but yet there's a real emotional punch in it. You know, I mean, when you come to realize what the title actually means, that ha ha ha, you've got no da, it's suddenly, oh, okay, it's not just a comic thing. And similarly, I mean, Russell Carl Kelly, for all that he's a very funny guy, like if you track the books over the last 20 years, they're very much tracking what Irish, well, a certain element of Irish society has been doing, you know, through the Tiger years, the Crash, etc., etc. So I'm very interested in that, in following that thought for a while. Just how does one present social issues using the comic, or using black comedy sometimes? What would your thoughts be on that sort of idea?
Well, for me, I suppose because I started off when I started writing Russell Carl Kelly, I just wanted to send up schools rugby culture. I didn't have anything bigger planned than that. I didn't kind of have my eyes set on the sort of wider issues. This was around, sure. I suppose the first column appeared in January 1998. So it was a very, very early on in the Celtic Tiger. But it was all about rugby in those days. And it was about mocking the mothers and the fathers who would bring their kids, bring their kids to these matches. The dads who had the early mobile phones, which were about this big, fixed to their ears for the whole game, talking to the office while watching, Turlock or Traylock play in the Leinster School Senior Cup. And then the mums with the real seal fur standing in skerries watching the young lads play rugby. And then these sort of gangs and gangs of groupies, essentially, like from Mount Anvil and all these schools, throwing themselves at these horrifically ugly rugby players in a lot of cases, And so that's kind of what I was sending up. And I kind of, sure, yeah. I kind of observed all that when I was a sports reporter. I would go out to these games and cover them for the Indo at the Times. And so change happened around that time. It was around 99, maybe 2000, that people started to talk about the Celtic Tiger. And I started to more and more parlay some of the things I was seeing that were happening in Ireland into the column. And it actually, over the course of about three months, I'd say, it ceased to be about rugby at all. And it started to become about the Celtic Tiger. So I grew up in an Ireland where money was scarce, there wasn't a lot of money around. I remember when I left school, I bought a computer because I wanted to be a journalist, and it was a Wang. I don't know if you remember Wang computer in Limerick. I think it cost about $5,000 or something, this computer. And I paid off the electricity bill, and it was a weekly thing for about 27 years or something, I had to pay it off. And anyway, my dad had to offer the house as collateral against this computer, and that's how tight money was. And I remember in 2000, long before the computer was paid off, I got a letter from the bank saying I'd been approved for £10,000 loan. And I didn't remember applying for the £10,000. That was the thing that struck me. I was thinking, what maniac would give me £10,000? And so and I think that's when I started to become conscious of this change that was happening. The attitudes towards money were changing, especially towards borrowed money. There was a big sort of, there was changes in people's lifestyles and their aspirations. And friends of mine who, we grew up, we were working class, and we were all suddenly being processed into the middle class. And I just found these things really interesting. And I think the only way I could have written about these things was through comedy, because, a friend of mine, they got a hot tub in their garden. He grew up in the same council estate as I did in Ballybrack. And I called over to his house one day, and all of his family was sitting in this hot tub in the garden. It was the strangest thing, because I'd known for years and years, and I'd never seen any of his family naked before, and didn't really have any desire to, I think I'd seen just about enough of their flesh as I wanted to. But the whole family, mum and dad and all the kids, were sitting around on this sort of dull, overcast day in this hot tub, and the barbecue was going. And that's the Celtic Tiger, you know. And so I could only write about that through comedy, through the, you know, these changes that were happening in Irish life.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
I think in the case of Paddy Clarke, almost inevitably the child's eye view of the world was going to be comical. But then I knew quite early on as I was writing it that there was a dark fact that he was going to have to confront, that his parents' marriage was breaking up.
Sure.
And that, but again, it's going back to what I was saying earlier. I didn't have a scoop out measuring how much comedy to put in and how you know, or how to, you know, introduce the darkness. That came in a lot of the editing at the end when I printed it all out and put it on the floor and began to restructure it. But you know, any good story has the ingredients. I mean, the first book, which probably shaped everything I did, really, The Commitments, I wrote that in a way because I was a teacher in a particular place at a particular time, you know, a community school in Kilbarrack on the north side of Dublin. And I came from Kilbarrack, and it was fascinating actually to be aware of the layers, the societal layers that were there and the history that was there. And it was semi-rural when I was a child. And then by the time I was in my teens, it was, you know, housing estates, council estates and private estates, and that mix was there. And I suppose a few years into the teaching, I realized, you know, this is material. And I was spending all day listening to children and listening to adults. And I'm never aware of sort of suddenly waking up and realizing, but I think I probably was a listener anyway. And here was the opportunity to, you know, to do it for a living almost, you know. So when I wrote The Commitments, they were always going to be working class kids. They were only going to be north side kids. So that's where the seriousness came in at the same time as the comedy. The comedy was in the, you know, the formation of the band and things like that. And then the darkness to a degree was the fact that the band was going to break up. No great tragedy in a way, but it's there, it's inbuilt. The second novel, The Snapper, it's pregnancy, it was unplanned. These days it would be rape, probably.
That's what hit me about that. I mean, he comes, told Mr. Burgess thing comes across as very funny when you're reading it or watching it, but there is
in a way, that again, that's the storytelling. But in a way, it's almost narrator free, but the nearest thing to a narrator is Sharon, the woman who's having the baby, and she decides he's an idiot. She decides to take command of her story, to create a story, you know, the fictional Spanish sailor, and to insist that he is in fact the father of the child, and everybody must believe it, or they can rev up, you know, they can go away. So she commands the tone of the story in a way. That's where a lot of the comedy is, but lurking under the comedy, it's dark. And then again, anybody who's been through, or anybody with any imagination will understand as well that, you know, the news, I'm pregnant, is generally very, very good news. But within that good news, there's the anxiety of the following 9 months or the following 8 months, or, you know, depending on when the news is delivered. Will everything be okay? You know, that's inbuilt. I knew when I was writing the book that in that way, biologically speaking, everything was going to be okay. But part of the writing is that if you're going to do it properly, there's always the possibility that no, it won't be okay. You know what I mean? So it seems to me that every story has the ingredients for comedy and then for the darkness, because I don't think the comedy, it's a bit like life is meaningful because it ends. Don't want to go too deep, you know, but that's the fact. You know, if we lived forever, I think we'd stop. You know, so life, you know, there's somewhere in our minds we know that time, you know, time is finite. And it's the same, I think, with stories, that there's nothing that's just funny and there's nothing that's just tragic. It's, you know, if something is funny, it's because there's another possibility. If something is tragic, it's because there was another possibility. And the story, even if it's not stated, it's in the story somehow.
Sure, yeah. I remember talking to Mark O'Halloran about when he was writing Garage. And he said what he wanted to write in Garage was comedy with the comic turned down to zero, which I thought was an amazing thing to say. Comedy with the comic turned down to zero. Brilliant. And of course, then Adam and Paul, I mean, there's a real tragic line underneath the Beckett-like humor in Adam and Paul, but it's there always, comedy and tragedy wrapped up one another. I actually, when I teach creative writing, I always point to the opening of Snapper. Yar what? Such a great opening. Yar what? We're straight in. But then again, one of the strengths of most things, I think that you're writing, Roddy, you go back to certain family relationships and stick with them. Like that's a father-daughter relationship, and we don't often see that. It's beautifully done.
Thank you very much.
It really feels for her.
Yeah, he does. He loves her, and there's something very. I was writing a column. It's an interesting thing, really, about fathers and daughters. I was writing for 3 years. I wrote a column called Charlie Savage, and while it was, a weekly column or whatever, there were two categories of people that reacted to it. There were men who were the same age as Charlie Savage. There were three categories, actually. There were men who were the same age as Charlie Savage and recognized it and liked it. Occasionally, there were the wives or partners of the men who liked it as well and reacted slightly differently. And then there was young women.
Okay.
They loved it because it reminded them of their dads.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
So there is something. It's a bit different. I have sons and a daughter, and the love for them is kind of the same in a way, but it's different. It's a bit different. So okay. I was very keen to, first of all, to have a loving father in the book, and not a dour, wordless man who's going to clatter them at the slightest provocation or no provocation at all, which in a way was going to be a little bit different, but also that he would, take a breath, realize he was going the wrong route, making a big mistake, and admit it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that's where, if you like, that's where the comedy is, because it could have gone in a different way completely.
Yeah.
But I was very keen to write about a successful father-daughter relationship, because actually the place is full of them,
Yeah.
And it's remarkable actually how, in a way, few really glowing father-son relationships there are in literature as well. If you start counting them, there's the father and son in the Road, Cormac McCarthy's novel. There's the father and son in Danny the Champion of the World. And there's one that I just read recently, Pickwick Papers, Charles Dickens, Sam Weller, who's a servant, and his father. Yeah. They're both adults, but it's lovely, and the banter between the two of them is absolutely lovely. But I'm sure there are other examples, but actually just successful relationships between the generations, they're not all that plentiful.
No, indeed.
So it's terrific in a way to have the strange challenge of writing about a successful family, an emotionally successful family. Because it seems to be inbuilt to make the father hit out. And I did that in a different context, but it's almost almost expected.
Yeah.
So actually, no, I made a different type of father, and that may well be why The Snapper is still watched and read, more than 30 years after I finished it.
Okay, no, interesting. I'll just bring you in, Paul, because over the 19 novels, Ross develops, changes, marries Circa, has a kid, becomes a dad, becomes a granddad, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So to what extent, the same sort of question, has the family as such been important for the whole Ross trajectory? Well, and that's before we bring him to Bray. We will bring him to Bray, don't worry.
We'll bring him to Bray in a second. I mean, it's really interesting what Roddy just said there, because like Roddy, I can't think of many properly functional father-son relationships, and there certainly isn't one in my books, and the family, the dynamic, I wanted to write about a sort of family that was kind of in conflict, and the O'Carroll Kellys, they have this materially perfect life. They have all this money, this huge, Ross is now living in this huge house on the Bico Road. Parents live in this house in Fox Rock, and they were the places where people in my area growing up aspired to live one day. Everybody would talk about, if we win the lotto, people would say we're either going to move to Torquay Road in Fox Rock, which is where Ross grew up, or Bico Road in Killiney, which is where he's ended up living. But despite having all this good stuff going on, the family relationships are just completely and utterly dysfunctional. He has a father who loves him too much and a mother who didn't love him at all. And I kind of liked just that dynamic. I mean, Ross's relationship with his father is based on a real conversation I heard a kid have with his dad at a school's rugby match once. I was leaving the ground. It was the Blackrock match, and I heard this kid say to his dad, "I don't give a fuck how you think I played. Just crack open the wallet." And I just thought that was the most extraordinary thing to say. My father wasn't a violent man, but if I spoke to my father like that at 17, I would still be orbiting the earth now, you know?
Sure, yeah.
I just loved that dynamic. And I saw quite a lot of it around when I was covering schools matches. These dads, you know, the son was on the school's team, and, you know, you could kind of see the chest pumped out, and they'd swig it from the hip flask, and they were just sort of characters right out of my books, really, and they're still there. And then the mums, when you become what they call a senior cup mum, you enter this little kind of sorority. So all the senior cup mums socialize together. So they have dinners, and they have hairdressing appointments, and I just love those little worlds that sort of were created within this rugby world. But interestingly, Ross has actually turned out to be a very good father, I think.
Right.
And quite, because I think essentially Ross's instincts are kind. I think he knows he's an idiot and he's a jock, and he knows at some level that he's being shortchanged by his parents. I think he knows he is the product of bad parenting.
Okay, yeah.
And
yeah.
he's conscious of this. And he's actually quite a good father. Like, a lot of it happens completely by accident. Like, so they have triplets. Him and Zurich have triplets at the moment, and they're 4, 5. Actually, they're 3 in the book, but they're 5 in the Irish Times column. I have to remember I've got 2 completely separate narratives going on. But when they were born, Zurich read this magazine where it said, you know, if your child uses a swear word, don't correct the child, because you can create a taboo around a certain word.
Okay, yeah.
So this was the route they went. You know, it's got a very liberal parenting. And so 3 years on, the kids are still effing and blinding, and their vocabulary of swear words is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now they speak almost exclusively in swear words. So their answer is now to send them to a Gael school where they might swear in Irish and no one will understand them. But I think because his parents were so bad, it doesn't always follow, I think, that if you've had bad parents that you become a bad parent yourself. Like, you can arrest the cycle. And I think Ross is an example of somebody who does arrest the cycle. I think he's going to like, he's a really, really close relationship with his daughter, Honor. And Honor is just this demon child who nobody, even her own mother, can't see any good in. And he can see good in her, and they're like peas in a pod, really, you know. They think and everything. So that's the family, you know. But they are kind of the dysfunctional Southside families that I would know of, you know, that I would have kind of observed growing up, and, you know, kind of observed, you know, seeing them going off on skiing holidays, and then hearing about the kind of amusing kind of madness that went on within the family with all these interesting characters.
Yeah. And then back to Roddy. I mean, everyone probably loves Colin Meaney from The Snapper, but poor old Sean McGinley playing Charlo. I think we can still see him being hit with that frying pan by Paula. The Spencer family is a very different kind of family, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. But the inspiration for the frying pan came from Fawlty Towers.
Okay, right. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's such a resonant moment. I mean, it was such a shocking thing to happen.
There's a frying pan episode in Fawlty Towers,
yeah.
But then again, when that morphed into The Woman Who Walks Into Doors, the idea that the title, you only get half, you know, oh, she says she walked into doors because she's been battered. You know, it's such a moment.
It was a very different, you know, when I was coming up with family, first of all, I'd had enough really of the world of the Rabbit family. if you like, they were living in one house.
Yeah.
An emotionally successful family. The baby in the snapper is lucky to be born into that house. It's going to be crowded, it's going to be noisy, but that baby will be well loved, you know, consistently well loved, looked after. But I imagined that the Spencers lived next door. Same sort of house, same street. Not literally necessarily, but I just thought, well, you know, if I keep on writing about the rabbits, it'll become a bit shrill. And insistent, this is what it's all about. Whereas I knew this is not always the case. So I just thought, well, I'll close one door, then go out onto the street, go through the gate and into another door, through another door, and see what's going on there. And I decided I'd start with Paula, and you know, gradually built up. I decided actually when I was doing the television series, I'd start with Charlo, who's going to be the agent of an awful lot of the trouble. So in a way, it'd be a bit misleading, you know. Oh, here's the hero. Here's the, you know, the Jack the lad, you know, the neighborhood boy, and but actually, beneath the charm, you see quite quickly, he's a thug, you know, he's a bit thick, and that's where the whole story rolled then, because he goes into the house, and he has children, and he has a family, and he's not Colin Meaney. I remember seeing Sean play him, you know. I didn't go to many rehearsals, and very often at rehearsals for screen things, you don't really get a strong sense unless you're looking at a little screen, you don't really see what you're going to see 6 months, 9 months down the line. You know, it's quite a shock. And when I saw the first episode of Family, it really floored me because, you know, when you're talking to Sean, if you know him at all, I mean, he's not from Dublin for a start, and he's very gentle, you know, he's very, he's really good company, he's, you know, and there he was on the screen, you know, just strutting after playing a game of football, looking at people inappropriately, you know, but it was quite extraordinary. It was really, really quite extraordinary. So when I'd finished that series, I was, you know, the one character who lingered really was Paula, because I wondered, you know, how was she going to get on? I mean, you know, I'm quite happy to tell you that when outside of the book, characters have no existence whatsoever. You know, once I've finished the book, I've no curiosity at all. They don't exist. But with Paula, something about it, maybe because she was difficult to achieve, I wondered, you know, what would happen now that she had thrown him out of the house? So that's where the spark for the novel came from. I could imagine her sitting and writing it. The idea of Charlo picking up a pencil and writing something was just,
of course.
Unimaginable. So whereas I could imagine her sitting at a table and beginning to fill a copybook, no problem. So that's where it all started. But it was deliberately, just to an extent at the beginning, just for the heck of it, to get out of that world of the rabbits and to enter a different world. And once I started doing that, you commit to it, and then it becomes a very, very different type of story. And really, at first, you're super vigilant to make sure none of the rabbit world gets into this household.
Of course.
So it builds up a different type of humor. Paula can be a very funny woman, but she's angry. It's an angry kind of humor. Really angry, you know, that's where a lot of her anger goes, is into a line, you know. And she's also quite generous. And, you know, I made her an alcoholic then as well. And
that's right.
You know, added an awful burdens. If she'd been a real person, I'd have felt quite cruel, but she's not, you know, she's fictional. Makes for a better story. So I deliberately assembled a different world. It's very difficult to write, you know, really difficult to write. But once it began to roll, it rolled, you know. But that was the thinking there. I didn't want to just keep on writing about the same happy family, you know. I didn't want to actually change the nature of that family. So I didn't want to, you know, what the glory of Paul's work is that the family has changed, if you like, with the years. Right? With that particular group, at that time, I didn't want to do that. So I thought, well, I'd close that door and open up another one.
Yeah, sure. And then just very briefly, how did that become an opera?
Oh, yeah, you know, I don't remember many details. It's quite a while ago. An inquiry came in from a composer, Chris de Voort, a Belgian composer. And he had got a commission to write an opera. I can't remember the opera company, based in Antwerp in Belgium. And would I be interested in the libretto, writing the libretto? And I thought, you know, I very young children at the time, and it would have meant a lot of travel and a lot of backing and forthing and going and spending time in Antwerp. And as well as that, I felt far away from opera. So I said I wouldn't do it myself. So they commissioned somebody to do it. But then the composer and the director were looking at the book, and they decided that they just lift chunks of the book out and use the text as their text, so to speak.
Okay.
I remember going to Antwerp. I hadn't given it much thought, but myself and a friend, we went to Antwerp to see the opera at the opening night, and it was the most incredible experience. Going in the back way, you know, and hearing the orchestra warm up, the sawing of the strings and things.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Jesus, you know. And then really, when I was listening to it, and they had the, you know, the surtitles, and realizing I wrote those lines 6, 7, 8 years ago, you know. And
Okay, yeah.
You know, it's music.
The libretto, yeah.
Yeah, it was brilliant. It was a great experience, and I'm glad in a way that I wasn't involved in it. I was involved in an opera later on, but I'm glad I wasn't involved in that one because I really liked the surprise of that evening.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It was just great. And they had 2 women playing Paula, one speaking and the other singing. It was a African-American woman called, her surname was McFadden, and she sang, and then a Dutch woman did the speaking. I can't remember her name, which really makes me feel bad, but the same, it was, so there was just those 2 on stage. And there were no tunes. I didn't come away humming. You know, it wasn't.
But that's opera for you.
The Wizard of Oz.
And then I suppose that segues, Paul, into my questions for you about your musicals, Anglo and Copperface Jacks. Where are these coming from? Why musicals?
Well, I mean, I never had any desire to write a musical. Like but I never had any desire to write a book. Like, you know, I wanted to be a sports writer from the time I was about 11, and I never really stopped. And I suppose I just sort of got, you know, the Ross thing took off, and I took a 2-year sabbatical from sports journalism, and suddenly I discovered I was a full-time author quite by accident. And I suppose the musicals came from that, really, because I suppose I'm quite well known as a comedy writer. Somebody had the idea of doing Anglo the musical, and because I covered a lot of that area in a kind of satirical way in the Ross columns and the Ross books, they asked me if I'd be interested in doing it. And it was Darren Smith from Kite and Donald Shields from Verdant. And it was really exciting at the time when they approached me. They had booked the Bord Gáis Energy Theatre for a month-long run in October or November 2012. They wanted to be a puppet-based musical, and you know, and it was just really exciting. You know, the only problem was 2 problems. One, time was really, really tight. I think they approached me in the start of April, and the show was going on in October. But then the other problem, which nearly killed me, was that at some point just before we started rehearsals, there were charges in the Anglo case. And of course, when somebody's charged with a crime in Ireland, it means, you know, you're precluded from talking about it publicly.
Sure. Yeah.
And you know, you know, on the understanding that there could be people in the audience who listen to you singing songs and making jokes about Anglo, and you could find yourself on the jury and be swayed by what you've seen a few weeks earlier in the Bord Gáis Energy Theatre. So it turned into a legal battle. I mean, the musical, you know, I don't look back on on that with any great pride. You know, I look back on getting through it with great pride. You know, it was about surviving it, and we knew it from the very beginning because, you know, we had Sean Fitzpatrick's solicitors trying to close us down. We had to remove the Sean Fitzpatrick puppet from the musical on, you know, the threat of a court injunction.
Okay.
We had the DPP writing to us daily saying, "Do not put this show on. Whatever happens, do not put this show on." But the producers have been advised. Their legal advice was that the fine for contempt of court was about 50,000 euros, and I think they spent about 150,000 euros on the production. So financially, in a really perverse way, financially, it made no sense to actually pull it. It made more sense to defy the DPP to go ahead. But just before we opened, actually the night before the first preview, we got a letter from the DPP who had asked to see the script at a very, very late stage, and they wanted changes to 16 scenes. And when I say change, like changes meant drop the song, the big song that ends Act 1.
Okay.
They said the character who sings this line here, that could potentially identify him as X person from the Anglo, who worked in Anglo. So you need to change that to something else. This is the night before we opened. So I stayed up the entire night before rewriting the whole show. And I went into theatre that day, and the actors are getting ready, and we're trying to persuade them to, they have their cues, so
Of course, yeah.
they've been practicing for weeks and weeks. And you're saying, well, do you remember you said that? Do you think you could say this line here, scripted by our lawyers instead? And it was a terrible time, really. It was really, really horrendous time. I remember sitting in the audience on the opening night, and 3 seats in front of me, there were 3 men in suits with yellow legal pads writing down all the jokes. Absolutely every joke they were writing them down. And I really thought it was going to be injuncted. I thought we were going to have one performance, and we'd be in the High Court and we'd be told, okay, you're in contempt of court the next day. But we got through it. But Coppers was a totally different experience, and Coppers was just a pleasurable experience from start to finish. And it was, it was the same people, Darren and Donal, who were behind Coppers. But I was writing about something that was happy. We went too early with Anglo. That was the other problem. Apart from all the other problems, we had the legal problems and everything. The public wasn't ready to laugh yet about Anglo. Okay. Couldn't sell tickets. I mean, there were nights in the Bord Gáis Energy Theatre where we had maybe 200 people there, and 200 people in the Abbey will be all right, but 200 people in a theatre that seats 2,000 people.
Yeah, it looks bad, all right.
And you need atmosphere for a musical. You need audience feedback and everything. And so Coppers really was the perfect musical because it was just the right time. It's a subject that has very, very happy associations for people, and I remember being in the audience and just a totally different feeling talking to people. Saying, me and my husband, we met each other in Coppers 15 years ago, and that's why we're back. This is our first date. We've got 4 kids now under the age of 10, and this is our first date for 5 years and stuff like that. So it was a totally different experience, But to answer your question, I don't know how I got sucked into it. I've absolutely no idea. We're totally against.
Well, I suppose before the legal men come down and before Dublin gets shut down this evening, we better bring Ross out to Bray. I believe he's going to be training this football team. Will you read us a little extract from Braywatch?
Will you hang on just a second? I need to across the room. I don't want you to think I have copies of my own books just at hand here,
Yeah. I hope we have time, Roddy, to talk a little bit about you write for children, and you've done historical research for a star called Henry. I'd love to be able to talk a little bit about those if we get a chance.
Yeah, I'd rather the children thing. I doubt if I'll write for children again. My own children are adults now, so it feels like a while ago. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So I'd be dredging the back of my head trying to think of something to talk.
Okay. But what I may be able to ask is the sort of research one has to do when one is setting a novel 100 years ago.
Right.
So if you hold that at the back of your head, hopefully we get a chance to talk about that. Yeah. The Henry Smarts trilogy. Mm-hmm. For curiosity, was that conceived as a trilogy, or was that a novel that then became 3?
It became 3. Yeah, it was going to be a long novel, and then it was becoming too long. And then I thought, actually, this is a great place to end the first volume. And that took 3 years, So no, I never saw it as a trilogy. No more than I saw the first 3 books as a trilogy either. Just 3 books.
Sure.
People started calling them the trilogy, and I sort of fought it at first, saying, no, it's not a trilogy. And then I gave up, So, no, why a trilogy and not... Well, I then wrote another of the Rabbit books years later when Jimmy's a middle-aged man, but no, I didn't sit... I've never I wouldn't plan in that way.
Yeah, sure.
I wouldn't be
Okay.
thinking ahead that far ever,
Okay. Okay.
especially as I get older.
Well, hopefully we'll come back to talk a little bit about the sort of research one has to do with one is
Yeah,
setting him up 100 years ago. But
carry on.
let's hear Ross as he enters Bray, just in front of lockdown.
Well, I'm actually going to read you something from the prologue, which
Okay,
involves,
great.
Charles. They're going to Oris on Uachtaráin, but I'll talk in a second about the idea of bringing Ross to Bray. But the book starts with Charles O'Carroll Kelly started a sort of, you'd probably call them a populist political party a few years ago called New Republic, and they've just won an overall majority in the general election. He's got some very, very dodgy Russian connections, and they're believed to have helped him pull this off. So they're on the way to Oris on Uachtaráin to collect his seal of office, and it's just minutes before he's told that the result of the general election has been suspended due to suspicious activity around voting patterns.
Okay.
I honestly haven't seen the old man this happy since the day Sean Fitzpatrick was cleared of, I don't know, whatever it was he was accused of doing. I mean, who even remembers anymore? He runs his hands through his hair/wig and goes, "It's a day for the ages, Ross, quote unquote. Children will read about this in their history books." "Our children," the old dear goes, trying to maneuver her mouth into something resembling a smile but failing miserable. Sorry, I'll read that bit again, sorry. "Our children," the old dear goes, trying to maneuver her mouth into something resembling a smile but failing miserably. She ends up just grimacing like a fucking baboon with thrush. He takes her hand in his. "That's right," he goes. "All 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them will be born into a world where they will truly know the meaning of the words Macte, Virtute, Sic Ictar ad Astra. Excellence is the way to the stars, eh, Kicker?" Hennessy smiles to himself as he stares across the river at the Four Courts. "Datum perfectus manus," he goes. Hist. It always brings out the Latin in the two of them. Kenneth looks over his shoulder. He's like, "What's the story, Taoiseach? Are you wanting me to drive up and down the quays one more time?" "I don't know," the old man goes. "How long have we kept Michael D waiting?" "Well, it's about an hour, Taoiseach." "An hour? No, I think that should be sufficient time for the famous Michael D to reflect on the momentousness of the occasion. And hopefully tell the staff to get the good cognac out. I should think the day calls for it." So that's how it starts. He goes to Bray. Ross has had a kind of strange relationship with Bray over the years, you know, because he's always referred to it as Bray of all places. And it sort of held this, I suppose, this kind of position of horror in his head. Like, you know, he kind of, his ultimate nightmare is to kind of take the wrong turn off the Loughlinstown roundabout and somehow find himself in Bray. And he's had all these terrible experiences there. He was at a house party about 3 or 4 books ago, and it was a Downton Abbey theme party in a house, and he had to dress up as the Dowager. And on the way home, the car broke down, or he ran out of petrol, and he had to walk through Bray and get petrol from a petrol station dressed as the Dowager. So he's always had these kind of comic experiences where he just leaves, going, "I'm never ever going back again." And I got a letter from somebody in the Bray Chamber of Commerce about 3 years ago, somebody who I know actually, who said, you know, because they know I'm always in Bray, you know, I'm a regular in Bray, and I drank there for many, many years, and I lived in Greystones, so Bray, you know, is always in Bray. I have friends there and everything. And she just said, "Why do you always write bad stuff about Bray? Why would you ever write a book in which you say something nice about Bray?" And that just got me thinking that, you know, what if Ross discovered the Bray that I know and love rather than the Bray that he knows and loathes? So I had this storyline in Schmidt Happens, the last book, where Ross encounters Joe Schmidt. His daughter Honor sends his tactics book. Ross keeps this tactics book and he brings it to Lansdowne Road and he writes his thoughts about rugby in it. But he never does anything with it. He doesn't have the confidence to actually send it out into the world. And his daughter, who he has this great relationship with,
she puts in an envelope and sends it anonymously to, oh, sorry, she sends it with a little note purportedly from Ross to Joe Schmidt. And Joe Schmidt rings him and says, well, what's the point in putting all this stuff in a book? Why don't you do something with it? You know, why don't you share your thoughts? Why don't you test your theories about rugby? So he sets him up with this interview. So at the start of the book, he's driving to Bray on the N11, and he has this recommendation from Joe Schmidt, and he goes to Pres Bray, big rugby school in Bray.
Sure, yeah.
And he does an interview, and he meets the kids from Pres. Pres is a great rugby school, but they haven't had a great rugby team in decades, you know. And I think the last Senior Cup was 90 years ago. But they produce great sports people down through the years, rugby players, and you know, like cricket, Ed Joyce and cricket, and Gary O'Toole and swimming. So they have a great history for sport. But the Senior Cup, the absence of Senior Cups, is the thing that really, really rankles with them. So Ross arrives in Bray, and initially he meets the kids, and initially he's trying to persuade them that, or their ambition is to, when they play Blackrock College in the Senior Cup, to keep the losing score below 100 points. And he tells them, you know, Dead Poets Society style, you know, you can hope for more. You can be better than this. You know, you can beat Blackrock College. And he gets them dreaming, and they go on a bit of a journey together that he hopes will lead to the Senior Cup final on St. Patrick's Day. But while that's happening, without realizing it, he's falling in love with Bray. And despite himself, you know, to his like he says, you know, this town, like it sort of gets into you like arthritis, you know, it just sort of gets into your bones. And so yeah, that's where that's going.
Why do I sense that as a badge of pride for me, you know, that he feels that way about Bray? I have to say. Yeah. Terrific. Okay, thanks. I might just say, while you were away, we had a great discussion all about you, Paul. We had a great discussion about just about a star called Henry, and I was just going to find out a little bit about. I mean, I know some of your books are set in the future, Paul, but going back 100 years, how difficult was that to do, Roddy? Just,
you know, in some ways, yeah, it was hard, but in other ways, there's no great difficulty, because the thing is that if we go, and I was writing the book I finished it in 1998, so it wasn't 100 years, you know, it was 78 years perhaps, back to 1920. And if we go back then to the 60s, when I was a kid, Eamon De Valera was the president, Sean Lemass was the Taoiseach. They were living men. De Valera was very old. Lemass wasn't particularly old. He was 16, I think, when he was in the GPO in 1916. And in a way, that gave me the figure of Henry Smart, an entirely different guy, but it was feasible that a child, you know, consider 16 to be, you know, a child really, would have been in the GPO. So it didn't feel all that historic.
okay.
I remember my father was a printer, but when I was a young child, he ended up teaching compositing, printing in Bolton Street College of Technology. And I remember going in with him a lot of the time. You know, sometimes we get the train in and we'd be walking up, and what were known as the slums, if you like, O'Casey's slums, Sean O'Casey's slums, they were still there. And I mean, a lot of the buildings are still there, obviously, but that world was still there just about, you know? Yeah. And so that when it came to describing it, yeah, I'd had to do a lot of research or whatever, but an awful lot of it was there, and family folklore and stuff like that. Photographs were brilliant, but a lot of history books. But one thing I read recently, Emma Donoghue's new novel, The Pull of the Stars, you know, which is set in a maternity ward in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. Right. And it's brilliantly researched. The detail is fantastic. But what interests me is that I read an awful lot about that period, you know, from 1916 before it and right up to the Civil War. And I don't recall anything really about the pandemic. And it was on full blast. There were people dying while the War of Independence was, you know, off, so to speak. And yet it's not there. And I don't think it's just that I don't remember it. It wasn't there, and it seemed to be unmapped somehow.
Okay.
Recently it makes me wonder why, because is it a bit like the famine, the shame of it all, you know, that it was really, there wasn't much literature around the famine, or, you know, it's something we'd rather avoid. And I wonder, was the pandemic, that last pandemic, the same? Because it wasn't in the memory of, you know, uncles and aunts either. They didn't have stories about the pandemic.
Yeah.
Ever. So, but that's where a lot of the, you know, and as well, you can go, the GPO is still there, you know, there are corners of Dublin which are as intact as they were, or certainly they were 2 years ago, 23 and 4 years ago when I was writing the book. And it's a bit like, my father came from Tala Village, and after he died, myself and my mother went to Tala Village to, you know, she wanted to see the old places, you know. So I used to go to where she grew up in Terranure in Tala Village or whatever. And you could stand at the corner where the Dragon Inn is now in Tala. And if you put the blinker on one side, you were probably looking at the exact same place as my father would have looked when he was a child in the 1920s. But when you took the blinker away, Lidl was down the road.
Sure, yeah.
You know? Yeah. And the Dragon Inn, which was there when my father was a child, probably more or less as was, but there was a poster for male strippers the following Saturday, and I'm fairly sure that wouldn't have been there in 1920.
Right, yeah.
Staring up at the window. But so at certain angles, you can, it's like any, you know, film sets, you know.
Yeah.
There's a couple of streets in Dublin that have been used for so many different cities, you know, of the 19th century, and you just make sure that you put the blinkers on and you don't look left or right. And so you can, it's easy enough to imagine yourself.
Yeah.
And then it's a question of choosing the words.
Well, once again, what I found extremely spot on about the Stark Old Henry, I grew up with my parents and my grandparents, and my grandparents were pretty much Crumlin, but my grandfather was born in 1898. Mm-hmm. So I knew all their slang all my life. Mm. And that's slang from the 1910s and 1920s, 1930s. And you can do research now, but you won't necessarily get into the rhythms of how people spoke back then. And you seem to have that spot on, like, you know.
Well, that's where you're hoping for the best, really, you know. You hope to get away with it. I think Paul would agree as well that, you know, to a large degree, writing fiction, you're chancing your arm. And you hope you get away with it, you know. If you're writing a female character, you hope you get away with it. If it's somebody outside your own experience, even if you're writing about yourself, you know, if you were writing autobiography, you'd still be hoping you get away with it, that you choose the right words.
Yeah,
so it's a certain amount of, you know, if you have the arm, you might as well chance it, I suppose. I'm never quite sure what chancing your arm means in a literal sense, but I still have my two arms, so I must be getting away with it.
Well, I just mentioned that expression. Again, I'm quite proud of this. Comes from the Butler family, believe it or not.
Does it?
When the Butlers and Fitzgeralds were great rivals, the Fitzgeralds were holed up in St. Patrick's Cathedral. No, the Butlers were, and the Fitzgeralds were outside, and they were trying to make peace. The Butlers asked Fitzgerald to put his arm through the door, and they'd shake his hand. So he chanced his arm, and they made peace. Wow. So there we are, a bit of Dublin history. Guys, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to the two of you, I have to say.
Is that right, Dave?
Sorry?
Say again?
That's where the Butler's Arms, there's pubs and hotels called the Butler's Arms. So presumably that's where what inspired that, is it?
Probably is, now you mention it, yeah.
What would the pubs
Anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you guys. It's really been...
What would the pubs be called if they told him to stick his arse out the door?
Kiss me arse. Guys, as I say, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to the two of you. I think it's been very, very entertaining.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Roddy.
Thanks, Roddy.
See you, Paul.
See you soon, all right? Bye.
Properly face to face. See you.